Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Melbourne AWS User Group Podcast, Season 2, Episode 2. Today, we'll not be talking about news, or rather, we will be talking about news, but it's a different kind of news, because we'll be focusing on our new shiny Melbourne region. And to do so, I'm joined by Matt Mariel.
Woo! Super excited.
And Jason Wood.
Hey, hello everyone.
And of course, we're also joined by Dawn.
Hi, good to be here again. Back from running around the US for probably altogether too long.
Well, it's good to have you back here just in time for this super special episode. So, shiny new region. We've been waiting for it for a bit over 2 years, I think. I forgot to look up exactly when it was announced.
reInvent 2020.
So, slightly over 2 years. And it was promised in the second half of last year.
Yeah, they're only a month off.
Reasonably close.
Built up that Christmas excitement and then just left us hanging.
Yeah. But now it's here.
Pop the champagne. Everybody's problems are solved. Wish you all a good night. Talk to you later. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. If but at least if you've got your basic interests, then hey, we've got your basics covered.
So I think I speak for all of us when I just at the outset I want to make it clear that we're really happy that this region is here, that we're excited about it, and that everything we're going to say from this point on forward is said with utmost of love, and just that we wish we could fast forward the region by about a year to make it useful.
We're customers. We deserve the right to want more. We deserve the right.
Yeah. Yes. Happy it's here. It's pretty much what we expected, but it's not what we wanted. We want all the shinies, not just, the important shinies.
Yeah, and the old shinies, basically.
Yeah. There are some interesting things, though, as Arjen pointed out in other places. The standard free tier now changed to your T3s.
Yep.
And so there was some, logical but surprising things that we weren't expecting there. So, that was an interesting.
Yeah. So just as a recap, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 1st of February. So hopefully everything we say will be completely outdated by the time you're actually listening to this.
Yeah, that would be nice. But yes, if you're going back and having a look at, what did we say last year, then yeah, hopefully everything's there. But hopefully people will listen to this sooner than in a year's time.
I hope so too. Otherwise, I will have failed badly with the editing.
We have faith in you, Arjen.
But yeah, generally speaking, let's have a look for a moment on what we have in our new shiny region. So there are a total of 48 services that are in one form or another available. So just because it says a service is available, be clear, that does not mean that everything from that service is available. Obviously, big point there is EC2. You won't get every single instance type in your new region.
You won't get a lot of instance types in your new shiny region.
Yeah, and maybe not in every AZ as well, which was something that we'd saw in Sydney for quite some time. So that's something else to be aware of. I know a few times we had some customers in Sydney that then wanted to try a DR sort of in a different AZ, but that was the instance type was in two AZs, but not the third one, which just happened to be the one that they wanted to test in. So yeah, so there are some things that you'll need to be aware of and check out when even when instance types are there. It's happened before. It could very well happen again with Melbourne. Just be aware.
Yeah, exactly. As Matt earlier alluded to, there really isn't a lot of instance types available right now. So on the AMD 64 side, so the original pre-Graviton type instances, we have more choices, but that's all last generation still. So it's the R5s, C5s, and M5s, none of the 6s there, and as well the T3s and i3 instances. And those are the only ones that are available at the moment, which I carefully checked by clicking in the console and seeing every other option grayed out or not. So obviously new instance types will show up over time. Older instance types just won't appear. And that's why something like the T3 micro is now our free tier instance type, which is nice and something they should do in every other region as well. But
the disappointing thing, I guess, from sort of where I'm sitting, we've been unfortunate, and by we I mean Australians, have been unfortunate in that for years now we've only had a single region, and this was kind of the one shoot to go, yay, multi-region DR, multi-region failover, where you've got data sovereignty or latency concerns can actually be a real thing. And at least as it stands today, probably not as drop-in replace as we were probably hoping. It's pretty clear that regardless of whether or not you use EC2, RDS, any of those sorts of core services, you're either going to need to have been very lucky in the instances you picked in Sydney, or you're going to have to do an apples and oranges to get it to work, which, are you better to do apples and oranges now, or are you better to wait and see how long it takes them to iterate on a new region? Because if you look at the AWS News RSS feed, every other post is about AWS releasing services in a region somewhere. Time will tell how quickly they add to Melbourne. My gut feel is it probably won't start straight away. My guess is they probably want to bed down what they've got first before, expanding too rapidly. But hey, I've been wrong numerous times before, and I'm sure I'll be wrong again. Maybe this is one of them, maybe it's not.
Yeah, but at least with that DR law, if your main concern is your data, then at least the basics, S3 buckets, your EBS volumes. If you could get those sides of things across.
No EFS.
I did not mention EFS.
That's the one. That's the one that caught me out. Was yes. No.
Yeah, I'd not quite looked that up in the available services just yet. So I was like, yes, I know S3 will be there. I know the EBS is there, and they just say too that along with that, one of the services that I was a little bit disappointed with that didn't launch was AWS Backup, which I think backup is a pretty core service if you want to run, EC2 instances. That said, you've still got your EBS snapshots, and it looks like Data Lifecycle Manager is there, so you can. Lifecycle Manager is not terrible, so at least you can do something there to protect any instances you've got. It's nowhere near as featured as AWS Backup or some of the third-party ones, but it's serviceable. But yeah, I would have liked to have seen AWS Backup in. Yeah.
So, but yeah, with some services missing. Actually, one of the big ones I also find that's missing is something simple like Transit Gateway. If you're going to use a new region, it is usually considered a nice thing to be able to connect to it from the old one.
Yeah, definitely. That's sort of a big one that's missing, because you want to try and keep your networking consistent, and your Transit Gateway, that's a big out. But yeah, with everything, let's fingers crossed and hope that's one that will come sooner rather than later. So yeah, and just to go back a little bit on the EC2 instances, so just having a look at the pricing page, which has the number of instances. So Sydney currently has 434 available instances, and Melbourne has, I think it was like 118. Let me just flip back to it. Yeah, 118 instance types. So yeah, there's about a quarter of available instances there.
That's actually better than I thought when I just did a visual search in the console.
Yeah, and it might be interesting to see too whether they get some of the older instances as well. So they just say the T2s aren't there and they're starting at T3s. So where, Sydney has, some of your old instances, your R4s and the like, and it's like that, maybe they'll never come to Melbourne. So, while it's sort of a quarter of what Sydney has, it may be that we'll get close, but not to the same amount because they'll, sort of drop all those obsolete instances or the types that they want people to move off.
My guess from playing around with some of the regions which have been introduced before Melbourne is some of those instance types we will never see. Because I've done some things with multi-region before, and it is quite interesting to go through and actually see in every region, particularly those free tier instances in every region are very subtly different depending on exactly what got deployed when. So certainly in some of the newer regions, the T2s are not there and have never come for regions which have been around for quite some time. The other thing that I think will be really interesting there is if people do decide to take that multi-region path, how many companies are still running on these obsolete instance types and are now going to decide that they have to re-architect everything just in order to use multi-region?
Banks.
Yep, probably. But yeah, I suspect you've got a good point there, Dawn. There's going to be a lot of those cases because, there were some big shifts in architecture at some point, and that required a whole bunch of updates. But then it's probably a good thing anyway if people start upgrading the instances because...
having also recently, as in earlier today, looked at a comparison chart of different types of EC2 instances for the purposes of basically deploying an entirely new setup for something. The price differences when using the newer generation instances are incredibly noticeable. I was looking at both the memory optimized instances and the compute optimized instances, and if you look at basically the M6s and C6s, the M5s and C5s are not even competitive, and anything older than M5, there's just absolutely no point whatsoever. So it will be really interesting to see, and I'm suspecting, Matt said banks, I'm suspecting it's actually going to be anyone who has a requirement for low latency and anyone who has a requirement for that multi-region backup. And a lot of the companies that fall into the latter group will already be doing this, but they'll potentially be doing something like that multi-cloud. So you solve that yourself, or you do the thing that gives us all job security and you hire a consultant to solve it. Those sorts of scenarios, you potentially massively cut your complexity by moving everything to Melbourne, and you might get the instance upgrade. You might kind of have to roll in the instance type upgrade, into the bargain, right? So massively reduce your complexity and potentially actually reduce operating costs, because the two operating costs that you then lose if you're currently operating multi-cloud are the operating cost of, okay, we're using really old instances, if you are, but also the operating cost of, hey, wait a minute, we suddenly don't have these massive data egress costs and data ingress costs to get everything from one cloud to another.
Yep. I think there will still be some requirements for the multi-cloud, but I'm all in favor of just using that as a data backup source or target. But yeah, with the new instance types though, what I was really surprised by how little Graviton instances there are in the new region. So for EC2, there's a couple options. M6s, originally only the ones with the native SSD, the big SSDs included, but now also just regular M6Gs. And that's the only Graviton source I saw. You can't use them in RDS, you can't use them in Lambda, can't use them anywhere really. And considering how much I have been feeling that AWS is pushing us to use them, that really surprised me.
Yeah, it almost feels like, and look, we've seen this when they release new services. It's the MVP almost thinking of it as a quasi canary kind of release here. We will give the people the basics, because let's face it, a lot of the core services, your Lambdas, your DynamoDB, RDS, EC2, S3, like there is enough there to build most common bits and pieces. The one big killer on the compute side is obviously a lack of Kubernetes. Personally, don't care. I think my personal opinion on Kubernetes is well documented at this point.
Oh yes, quite.
But it's like let's give the people enough to be able to do things. It may not be 100% of what they want, but it will be enough for AWS to bed down the services, to validate the usage, validate capacity planning, and then start directing where do we point the fire hose as far as what we build and release next. And that was only kind of sort of a pun of a reference to a lack of kinesis, but yeah.
Yeah, but interesting that say that as well, bedding down and pointing things out. I think one good thing for people to remember is if it's missing a service that you really want, talk to your AWS reps, let them know, because the more things that people ask for, as the heat map goes up, they're more likely to roll those services out that most people are asking for. So don't.
Who wants to take bets on how many PFRs are going to be raised in the next 30 days?
Yeah, I would not want to be an AWS an SA or a TAM dealing with any of the customers who are trying to move things into Melbourne right now, because I imagine that the phones are probably ringing off the proverbial hook.
Pretty much.
Yeah, because we all know that's what everybody wants, and so please make sure you file your request for work docs, everybody.
Well, there's actually a funny little quirk there, because if you run and this is something that I've seen people do when they send out the links. If you run your AWS accounts off AWS SSO and you use a custom URL, you get that prefix.awsapps.com/start, which will take you to your SSO sign-in portal. But if you have just prefix.awsapps.com, that takes you to the work docs portal. So I'm actually mildly curious if you went in whether it's going through one of those things. I don't even know if SSO in Melbourne is active yet. As I said on the panel,
it's not.
Yeah, I was figuring probably not. As I said on the panel, I have all of my stuff set up in error because it's a region which things come to fairly quickly. But I'm curious what will happen if SSO gets released before workdocs, because that url.awsapps.com actually goes, if you omit the start at the end, it actually goes to the workdocs portal. So I've seen multiple times people send out the short URL. I wonder what would happen. Like that's going to end up being a breaking bug for someone at some point.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I suspect it will come around the same time so that they can work around that issue. Because I so hate that you need the /start. I have spent so much time telling people to put the /start behind it when they couldn't log in.
Same. It's just one of those weird quirks of how the UIs are set up.
Yeah, it's just like just bookmark the URL and click your bookmark. Don't type it in.
Yeah. Well, it's not that you can't type it in. You just have to know what it is that you're putting into the console, right?
Yeah.
If you know what it is that you're putting in, you end up being fine. But there are a lot of people who don't, and that's where you then run into issues.
Yeah.
Like everyone, I'm sure everyone who works with AWS SSO, I refuse to call it IAM identities.
It's like,
just on principle alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone who works with AWS SSO has been caught by that at least once, right?
Yeah, yes. The service formerly known as.
It is, yeah. I still don't understand why they changed the name of that. It's the most baffling thing.
I actually don't mind the identity center part of it. It's just that they had to put IAM in front of it. That's a bit of a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Maybe it was someone's April Fool's joke that just went too far.
Again, I repeat, ATM machine.
Yeah, it's all your PIN number. Yeah.
Yes. Funny how all of those examples come back to banks, isn't it?
Yes, but it is, for as much as we're hanging on things, as you said at the start, we are all super glad that it's here. It now, definitely now gives us options for, the in region, this time meaning in country, countries type, but yeah, it gives us that in country sort of DR, extra region for those, services that need to have data residency. Availability zones are pretty safe, but if you're really risk adverse, having that separation between Sydney and Melbourne for your data, that's a good thing.
Risk averse. You've got compliance requirements. This is huge for a large number of industries. And as Dawn was sort of saying before, look, those who have needed multi-region, data center, multi-location previously have done it through the use of multi-cloud or a hybrid on-prem solution or something. And this gives you the option to, centralize, to standardize, missing instances notwithstanding. Missing services notwithstanding. So this is fantastic. This is going to keep a lot of people very, very busy for at least 2023.
This is going to keep a lot of consultants very, very employed for at least 2000.
Well, that too. That's
yeah.
Considering we're all consultants on this podcast, it's like we are all looking at very busy years.
I actually want to pick up on the data center comment that you just made there, because that's quite interesting in that we sort of look at this as a lot of people will have done this. A lot of people who have that compliance requirement will have done this basically multi-cloud. But the other thing that we might see here is this might actually lead to quite a lot of places decommissioning their data centers, which they've been using for backup purposes. And again, obviously, that's going to keep consultants very employed for at least 12 months. So that's nice. But it's also going to be quite interesting to see then how that changes things like data center capacity around the Melbourne region and in the Melbourne IT community. Because just thinking about it and thinking about sort of the history of some of the big players that I know are still using some sort of data center in Melbourne, I suspect a lot of those big players, now that they potentially can, are going to be in a very big rush to obsolete. They're going to be in a very big rush, basically, to start turning things off.
Well, let's be frank here. Colo pricing is horrendously expensive in Australia.
Oh yeah,
especially in Melbourne and in Sydney.
Yes, and it's not just that. You then also have to take into account all of the costs for maintaining that data center, all of the costs for maintaining your configuration around it, your setup, and
network infrastructure, staffing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to have that. My understanding from talking to people who've worked on the data center side of things in the past is the cost of having people come in and maintain your data centers is hideously expensive here in Australia in general, just because we don't have that many people who can do it. A lot of people who have the ability to do that have gone where the money takes them, right? Because it's it's a niche skill set. It's a niche skill set which is incredibly valued by places that have historically needed to maintain some sort of data center, for whatever reason. And a lot of the people who are good with that sort of thing have jumped to cloud providers, and they've jumped to other countries.
I was going to say, I cannot physically remember the last time I stepped inside a data center. I used to live in them, and it's probably it would be safe to say I have probably not stepped inside a data center since probably 6 months after AWS launched in Sydney.
Yeah, I have the unique distinction. I think I'm not sure if it's actually unique to people on this call because I don't know how much you've been in data centers, Arjen, but I have the distinction of never having set foot in a data center at all because I'm in that age bracket and in that bracket of people who came into the IT industry cloud first.
Lucky you.
You make me feel old, Don.
Yeah.
You could, for those that are listening, we've got video turned on here, but you can see the grey in Matt's beard and especially in mine. I used to live in data centers. My family was sort of like, aren't you cold? And things was like, I used to live in data centers and walk around in shorts and t-shirts because I was just so used to
walking outside onto Collins Street in the middle of summer in a woolen jacket and going, why am I sweating oh, right, it's 40 degrees. It's 40 degrees.
Yeah. So,
and then you're the weird guy.
Yeah.
To be frank, you would have always been the weird guy, but
yeah.
we work in the IT industry. That goes without saying.
That's saying.
We are the weird. We are the weird people.
Yeah, but you're definitely right. A lot of us that worked in the data centers and stuff. There's not as many people around now that do that or do it well. And a lot of us have all jumped to cloud.
Yeah, because it became the self-fulfilling prophecy where everyone worked out that cloud was where the industry was headed. And as people got out of the data center racket, it suddenly became apparent that there's just not enough people who can do it and do it well anymore.
Yeah, and if you're doing that type of thing, you then got the hyperscalers that, obviously, on our side of the fence, we code it all up and that, but there's also that side that definitely needs to maintain all of the infra that we're happily coding up for. And I bet those places are a lot more interesting to work for anyone that's, still wants to touch metal than, your even your enterprises.
As, the resident person who tends to point out accessibility things is data center work is actually really hard work. You have to be not only have I never set foot in one, I probably couldn't physically do it because you have to be quite fit. You have to be quite physically well to be able to meet the demands of, okay, I have to run around, I have to run around data centers, pull cables, I have to be able to stretch, I have to be able to bend. So it's, particularly if you're working on the hardware side, it is really hard work.
And racking UPSs.
Yeah.
My God, those things are heavy.
There's a reason they're at the bottom of the rack.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and maintaining a local server farm is completely different to doing anything in a data center at that scale. And it's not easy work. There aren't that many people who can do it. And it will be interesting to see, because I do suspect that a lot of companies that have had that requirement are now going to be rushing to decommission it as quickly as they can. So it will be really interesting to see how that works out. Does it noticeably change the demand for data centers in Australia?
Yeah, it's a really interesting line of thought there for that, because not only are you getting out, but you've got different infrastructure to keep management of, and keep your CMDBs and your documentation for how do we rack this physical stuff? How do we config all this physical stuff different to our cloud environments? Whereas now, ideally with your DR, it's just create another pipeline to this location, and bang, away you go. Or,
or deploy it using the same pipeline, depending on what sort of networking tool, infrastructure as code tools rather, you're using.
Yeah. Or even if you just, want to go down to really basic level, if you're just using CloudFormation templates and manually just being able to go like, here we go, here's all the CloudFormation templates I've got for this, and just manually dump it into your other environment. It's super easy to just spin it up, assuming the services are available.
Yeah, that's going to be the sticking point.
Well, we're talking about moving out of the data centers. If you're currently in a data center and you're going to move to AWS, you're not used to all the 200 something services anyway. So then you basically go through the same thing that we've had the chance to go over 8 years ago or whenever Sydney opened. It didn't open with a lot. The only difference is now that by the time you get started, the new services will keep coming in at a much faster.
That is a really good point. Like, I remember a few, and by that I probably mean like 4 or 5 or 6 reinvents ago, I vaguely remember, it might have been Jassy, it might have been Werner, saying that like only 5 or 10% of all workloads had moved to the cloud, some really small number. And what you're saying sort of is a really good reminder. Like, we live AWS like all day, every day. Like, we've been doing this for a long time now. Like, we're sitting here complaining about the fact that we don't have the creme de la creme in Melbourne. But for most IT people, I would probably say, you're probably right. Like, what is in Melbourne today is what you would probably start with. You've got EC2, you've got RDS, they're your cores. You've got S3 for your object storage. You've got Lambda to get started in the event space. You've got Event Bridge. You've got DynamoDB, right? So you've got your core bits and pieces there. You've got step functions if you want to go a little bit more advanced. And let's face it, it's not until you get all of that under your belt that you're going to be looking for Kinesis or Security Hub or AWS Backup or, any of these more advanced services that you sort of go, and now I want X. And if AWS sort of take 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to bring some of those things in, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. And for those of us who have been doing it the whole time, well, we're already well versed in not having service or feature parity cross-region, because let's face it, we've never had feature or service parity across region, and never will.
Yeah.
And I think the other interesting point that comes out of that is that you look at anyone who has the need for, maybe not so much on the latency requirement, but anyone who has the need for that redundancy requirement. If you have that need, you're not using Kinesis as part of your core workload, most likely. You're not using, certainly if you're in Australia. If you're in any of the areas where multi-region has been a thing for a while, you probably are. But you're not using, Kinesis as part of your workload. You're not using SageMaker. You're not using a lot of these AWS custom rolled services, which are used for very specific use cases. You're using EC2, you're using RDS, you're using Lambda, you're using step functions. If you're in one of those highly regulated environments, which has requirements around data backup, data sovereignty, you are not doing these things. You are not using these services. It's just a simple fact that the reality of the situation is you are going to be using the core services which are already in Melbourne. Now, again, whether you're using the correct instance types or whether you have all of the underlying support for the things that you want to do, that's an entirely different matter. But if you're running these mission critical workloads, you're not using Deep Composer at any point in the workflow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
I do want to point out one thing though. If you're starting out in the Melbourne region, fresh coming to AWS, and you look at all the available services, do yourself a favor and ignore that simple workflow is there.
Yeah, what is with that?
Wait a minute. Simple workflow service made it into Melbourne?
Yes, it did.
It was one of the marquee services.
Really?
I want to know which enterprise customer in Australia is using that. Because there has to be a customer that demanded that be there.
Oh yeah, that was absolutely a request to the terms.
No, actually, I think it's on the list of of services that launch in every new region.
Huh.
There's a list on the infrastructure side, and I'm pretty sure it's on there.
Yeah. Maybe it's just a really simple thing that's,
Service. That really is.
it's a simple service. Yeah, maybe it's just here, we just throw this in because with everything else that we do,
Because it only uses EC2 and EC2 is going to be there anyway, so therefore...
Yeah,
we may as well push the button, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Secretly, it's just an API to Amazon Mechanical Turk anyway.
I mean, that's the kind of thing, you say that jokingly, but I'm sure that there are some AWS services that have those integrations snuck in.
I'm sure there are.
Okay. But one thing that Don sort of triggered my mind talking about latency, one of the good things that we can do now that we've got this region. I was going through a ward the other day, and the question came up about, have you selected your location based on latency and your requirements, etc. And traditionally that has been ignore this question due to architectural.
Yeah, we picked
Sydney. We picked Sydney because it's the only region. Now we actually have a choice. That question within the well-architected reviews can actually have a meaning.
Yeah, we picked Sydney because it's missing from Melbourne.
That is just going to be the reality for a while, I suspect.
It was something that I thought of, and we had a little bit of a chuckle when we did that war. And came across that question. It's like, tick that off, because it was at the time when it was launched, there was no other option. But now, it's some of those little things I think we'll find going forward now, like answers to that war question or those things like, why are we doing this? Well, hey, now we've got another region.
When you're designing something, when you're talking to a customer, like it's a thing now. Like it's a discussion point that needs to be thing. I'm going to need to bid you all adieu because it's 9:35 at night, and I have a 3-week-old that needs my attention. But I did just want to say one other thing. It's like we're sort of joshing here about the fact that this is missing, that's missing. We wish this was here. We wish that was here. How are we going to live with only 125 different instance types? 118, sorry. Two bits. Wow. Like, are we just like the whiny customers of like all time here? Like, and secondly, we now have the ability to do multi-region, cross-state architectures and solutions, having done nothing ourselves to accomplish that, but sit here for 2 years going, is it done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? Why didn't you hit 2022? And that's kind of like one of the big things that a lot of people still may not necessarily remember is the cloud's constantly evolving and expanding. And like if we we were talking about data centers before, if we wanted to put another region on ourselves, that is a monumental engineering effort. Like excluding the cost conversation, just the raw effort and materials and infrastructure needed to bring up a new site in a different state is mind-boggling. And the fact of the matter is, it's still way harder to enable the Melbourne region in your AWS account than it should be. That is perfectly legitimate gripe, but it is way easier than doing it yourself.
Yeah, it's not just the engineering requirements, it's the people requirements as well. The number of people that you need to set up a data center, then the amount of time and money that you need to sink into the HVAC systems, that you need to sink into the cooling systems, that you need to sink into redundancy, backup power, setting up network links. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of people that are required to set things up. It's a lot of people that are required to maintain the HVAC systems. And I'm actually going to say the bad word that nobody expects here, because one of the things that we saw when cryptocurrency and Web3 and all of this nonsense became a thing was how much people were paying for those overheads, to set up their Bitcoin mining farm or their Ethereum mining farm or their, I don't know, their Algorand mining farm or some of these weird names that I've never heard of.
Insert random crypto coin here.
Insert random crypto coin or Web3 ecosystem or whatever they're calling it here. Yeah. But we saw how much strain the requirements for all of that overhead were putting on, as you've got people setting up these crypto mining farms all over the world. That's been happening with traditional data centers for a very, very long time. And it's exactly the same requirements. It's exactly the same overhead. It's exactly the same people that you need.
Yep.
So, yes, on one level, we're sitting here complaining about this. But these are things which, unless you are a big bank or a company that has a lot of money in the bank or a company that has massive amounts of venture capital funding, you are not doing this yourself because you have to go in and enable the Melbourne region. That's 5 clicks. The other thing which we haven't really talked about all that much, which I do want to bring up related to that point, is it's not just that we have the Melbourne region now, we also have the Perth Local Zone.
Yep.
And I will let you guys talk to that on your own. Bidju, would you?
Thanks for being here, Matt.
The thing with the Perth Local Zone that I sort of wanted to talk about here is it's not just now around that latency requirement. Obviously, the subset of services that you can get in the Perth Local Zone is quite limited. But what that enables you to do is the latency difference between Sydney and Melbourne is, maybe 50 milliseconds at maximum. But because Sydney and Melbourne geographically are quite close to each other, having even the limited subset of features in Perth means that if there are workloads that you really need to run at the edge on the western side of the country, that is now a thing you can do.
Yeah, definitely. That was really good for those people because Perth is a long way away. And as limited as the local zones are, there's still a lot of core functionality that you can run out there. And for those, things that, really latency is important, you can sit them out there, do more than, what you could with an edge location. That's even more limited. But, you can actually run stuff close to you.
Yeah. And the Perth latency difference is really big. So one of my Perth-based colleagues, he did a check, and an instance in the Perth Local Zone from his home NBN connection, he can reach in 15 milliseconds.
That's quite good.
Whereas Sydney would be 58 milliseconds. So that's a massive change.
Yeah, and for my expectation would be, that's going to be vastly dependent on quality of your internet connection and things. There are some scenarios where you might actually see improvements that are more like going from triple digits down to double digits for some use cases. And that being able to do that's really good. And I'm interested to see, I probably won't be in Australia by the time it happens, but I'm interested to see when that becomes a full-fledged region, because I suspect that in 10 years or so, by the time that I'm well out of the country, we'll be looking at an AWS region in Perth at some point.
Possibly, yeah, if it keeps growing. In a way, the local zones are a path to growing, because in that regard, we've got another region coming up around us fairly soon. Like next year, the Auckland region should launch. But before that, the Auckland Local Zone will arrive.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting sort of thing, having a sort of like an interim local zone, just before the region comes up.
Yeah, it's a bit like the Osaka region, but then sped up instead of staying as a limited region for 10 years.
I quite like it because it means that it does a couple of things. It gives AWS the ability to gauge demand, The other thing that it does is it means that people can get started. It gives people the ability to play around, to figure out what they can do, to understand how latency improvements, how all of the things that you get when you move over to a region that's closer to you can benefit you. And then it sort of gives AWS the chance to actually validate commercially, is this a thing we want to do before, again, they sink massive amounts of money into configuring data centers and such. So I think it's an eminently sensible way of doing things, because it also, like, it gives people the ability to get started and do something, even if you can't run whatever workloads you want to on the full feature set. You can do something.
Yeah, I was more thinking about, like, would it have made more sense to do, Wellington Local Zone and then deploy to Auckland? But then just thinking about that, it'd be because the Auckland Local Zone will be tied to Sydney. If they had Wellington Local Zone and then an Auckland region, would that Wellington Local Zone then still be tied to Sydney? that could be
who knows?
That could be confusing. So I suppose, have the Auckland Local Zone, and then once you deploy your region, the local zone goes away. Yeah, probably makes more sense.
Definitely an interesting time to be working in AWS in Asia Pacific, or in Oceania, really.
Yeah, and I just think too, like, it's going to be interesting for to also have a look at for Adelaide, to people in South Australia to make the choice of where do they connect to, Melbourne or Sydney. Have a look at what are your latency differences. Where do you get your link from?
From memory, having played around with that myself in another cloud provider at one point, Melbourne is generally faster, but not by much.
Yeah.
You're talking single digit milliseconds generally. And that obviously depends on the quality of your networking, quality of your data equipment. It depends on the quality of the links of the data center. But from memory, Melbourne is generally very slightly faster.
Yeah. So it'd probably come down to which state does SA hate the least? Do you have more of a grudge against Melbourne or Sydney?
Or realistically, it might be that because the latency difference is so small, it's going to come down to one of two things. It will be feature sets. So is everything that we need available in Melbourne? Is everything that we need actually deployed in Melbourne? Or availability, like, can we get the instance types that we want in the region that we want to deploy this to? Because that has been an issue in Sydney, that for some instances and some service types, the compute capacity is just not there.
Yeah, definitely. But yes, that was just a little bit of a joke. But yeah, still an interesting question for if you're in Adelaide, which is really that there's no, I suppose, really clear option between, Melbourne and Sydney. As you say, like, the latency is sort of negligible between the two. Feature set's going to be a big one until, Melbourne matures and gets most of the stuff. There's obviously that question there, as opposed to, like, Perth now, will has the local zone. So there's some there you'd most likely jump into Sydney. Brizzy, you'd probably still go to Sydney.
But they'll also get the local zone.
Exactly. And that local zone will be tied to Sydney. So, there are, you've got some that are obvious, which region do we go to? But I was thinking South Australia is that interesting one where it's, toss a coin,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's going to depend on exactly, I mean, the ultimate phrase in the IT industry, right? It depends. It's going to depend on exactly what you want to do, exactly how you want to do it.
Yep.
And maybe which city you hate the least.
Yeah.
Let's hope most choices are a little bit more pragmatic than that.
Would be nice, but people are people, right?
And with that, I believe we have gone on long enough. We're happy. We've got the new region.
Definitely. Still party poppers.
Yes, we are spoiled.
Yeah.
As much as we've complained about things that aren't there, I think the overall feeling is party poppers. Yay, it's here.
Yeah. And also, we're not going to be out of a job. Consultants in Australia are not going to be out of a job in the near future. And depending on exactly what you're doing, I'm suspecting that for a lot of consulting companies, the phone's going to be ringing off the hook about now.
Cool. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening. Of course, I also want to thank our sponsors, CMD Solutions, the user group's gold sponsor, as well as Versant and CIFO, who are silver sponsors again this year. All three of them. Then, of course, Matt has already left us, so I'll thank him again. He's quiet. So, Dawn, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me as per usual. It's always a pleasure.
And Jason, thank you as well.
Thank you, Arjen. Always fun to be on here and chatting with Matt and Dawn as well. And thank you for hosting.
And, of course, if you want to reach out to the user group, give feedback on our talk, disagree with us in any way you want, you're welcome to do so. You can find us on social media. We are on LinkedIn these days as well, active. AWS user group and then Melbourne in brackets. You can also find us on Mastodon as AWS Melb at awscommunity.social. And if you're actually still using Twitter, we're still there, not active, but we're still there as at AWS Melb. And of course, join the Slack, which you can find on our website at melb.awsug.org.au. And with that, I bid you all a good day.
Good night.
Good day, good night, good time zone appropriate greetings.